Hi, my name is Dr. Kimberly Reeve. I'm the chair of the Business and Finance program at the King's College. And I love teaching at King's for many reasons, but one of them for sure is because of our location in the middle of Manhattan. We're actually in the middle of the financial district. And we are steps from Wall Street, but also steps from so many other fascinating aspects of New York City. And today I just want to take you on a virtual field trip that's going to share some of my favorite secrets of Lower Manhattan and really focus on the entrepreneurial roots of New York City. And these are all within just a few blocks of the King's College. So come and join me on our virtual field trip. Just to give you an orientation, this is a picture that shows the greater New York metro area, and this includes all of the boroughs of New York City. You can kind of sort of see them all, but New York is actually quite large, and you can kind of see that we typically focus on the island of Manhattan in the center there, but we also have Staten Island to the left of the island of Manhattan, and then we have Brooklyn and Queens to the right. Zooming in a little bit more, you start to see some of the more familiar landmarks. So Manhattan is an island. You'll see that. It's got water all around it. And you can kind of see Times Square, Grand Central, Empire State Building, and then a little further south is Washington Square Park and the Arch. And King's is just a little bit further south from there. So this is zooming in again, and we're on the southern edge of the island of Manhattan, and you'll see the King's College in brown just right below the flag for the Federal Hall National Monument. So that shows you we're just right around the corner, and we're going to start our field trip at Federal Hall. And before we get to the physical building of Federal Hall, I wanted to share with you what the island of Manhattan looked like in the 1640s, because it's just a little bit different than how we see it today. It's important to realize that in the 1640s, the island of Manhattan was inhabited by the Dutch, but before the Dutch, there were the Lenape and the Canarsie Indians. And it really was a wildlife area. It was completely undeveloped. And here you see the Dutch settlement. So this is a picture of once the Dutch had landed and started to settle the territory, the island of Manhattan. This was all on Lower Manhattan, all actually below Wall Street. So historically, you're looking at probably the equivalent of about 3 city blocks was the entire settlement of the Dutch territory, which was called New Netherland. But it's always fun to see kind of the original photos of what Manhattan looked like, because it's really different from what it is like today. So we are moving just around the corner from King's and going to Federal Hall. And Federal Hall is important for a number of reasons, but the original building that we're looking at in this picture was built in 1703, and it was New York City's first city hall. And then after the Revolution, it served as a meeting place for the Congress of the Confederation. And it has been rebuilt a few times, so this is not the building that we see today, although it is in the same location. But most notoriously, George Washington was inaugurated in this building. So that's why I wanted to start with this picture, because if you look at pictures of the inauguration, you'll see this very building. So George Washington was sworn in as our first president in this very building. And just notice the streets, not paved, it doesn't even really look like cobblestones there. And another fun thing, you can see the influence on the right-hand side of the Dutch architecture. So if you take a look at the red building on the right-hand side, if you go to Amsterdam, you'll see all sorts of buildings that look exactly like that. So the Dutch definitely left their influence in many ways. This is Federal Hall of 1789, so we are now fast forwarding to the depiction of the day that George Washington was inaugurated. So that is his horse-drawn carriage that is being pulled up right in front of Federal Hall. If you look over to the left, you'll see Trinity Church. So we'll get to Trinity Church at the end of this virtual tour today. But it's just fun to see that that was really a landmark at the time. And in fact, ships used to navigate by the steeple of Trinity Church because it was for decades, actually almost a century, the tallest building in New York City. So they would really use it as a beacon, not only of hope, but also as a navigation point. This is the Bible that George Washington used for his inauguration, and this is actually in Federal Hall. So it is owned by the Masons, but they have it on permanent loan to Federal Hall. So it's almost always there when you get to go to Federal Hall. But again, just amazing. This is a very historic artifact that is steps away from King's. This is the current Federal Hall building. So this is a structure that you'll see today. You absolutely will see that daunting set of stairs leading up. And you'll also see the statue of George Washington standing in the front. And the current building, it's a national park facility. So it actually isn't used. There's a little bit of office space in there for the park facility, but that is about it. But the building has served a number of purposes, and in 1842, from a business perspective, one of the most interesting purposes it served was the U.S. Custom House. And before income taxes were put in place in the 1900s, the primary means that the U.S. had to make money was by taxing the cargo of ships as they came in and out of the ports. Because New York City was the largest port for years, New York City had a lot of financial power in the United States, and we still do. We still are the financial capital of the US and definitely a financial capital of the world. But it all started because we had a big port and we were taxing ships' cargo. So Federal Hall briefly served as a location for the US Custom House. So you would basically dock your ship and then walk to Federal Hall, which was then the Custom House, and pay the duty that was due on the cargo that you had brought in. Another thing that Federal Hall served as was a sub-treasury, and you'll notice in this picture, you can see on each side in the corners, those are actually safes. When it was the Custom House, if you couldn't pay your bill that was due on your cargo, no worries. Some kind soul would accompany you to your ship and offload just a little bit of cargo to basically pay your debt until you could come and reclaim it in exchange for cash. So those safes were built for the Custom House, but then because they were already there as safes, they became a place to store money when this building was used as the sub-treasury. We now have the Federal Reserve Building that is literally right around the corner from Federal Hall, and that's where all the gold is stored these days. So still in the same area, just a different building. As we walk through Lower Manhattan, either in person or virtually, there aren't that many old buildings, and the primary reason is because there were a lot of fires that swept through Lower Manhattan, and pretty much the fires of 1835 and then again 1845 destroyed about 75 to 80% of all the buildings in the area. So most of the buildings that we see today are from the late 1800s. The majority are really from the early 1900s, and that's why, because if you think of buildings being on fire, whole blocks burning down, there were no big fire trucks back then. So you really had to rely primarily on volunteer labor and volunteer individuals with their own buckets of water. So as you might imagine, not a horribly effective means of fighting large fires. This is a picture of the stock market of 1864, and I love this rendering because it shows some of the chaos that we would expect from a stock market. And it's interesting to note that for centuries, people have been trading on Wall Street. And in fact, we trace the roots of Wall Street back to the mid-1700s. And it wasn't until 1792 when there was the first panic on Wall Street. It's a long story, but you can Google the Panic of 1792 and learn all about it. But it was actually after that panic that led to the Buttonwood Agreement, and it's called the Buttonwood Agreement because before there were these big buildings on Wall Street, they were trees, and the traders would meet under trees, and they just met under the Buttonwood tree and came up with this agreement. But the Buttonwood Agreement of 1792 is what actually established what we know today as the New York Stock Exchange, and was really the first time that there was any sort of significant financial regulation on the buying and selling of stocks. The New York Stock Exchange is the oldest stock exchange in the US, and the current building, again, they all burned down, so the current building that we see is built in 1903, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Part of the history of New York does include the slave trade, and it shouldn't be too surprising because if you think of trade routes, the trade routes went from Europe, and a lot of Europeans were looking for spices in the Caribbean, but they would basically go from Europe and then they would stop in Africa. They would pick up slaves in Africa, then would travel to the Caribbean. Sometimes slaves would come from the Caribbean as well, and then they would go north to drop off slaves and pick up additional raw materials. So the slave trade actually took place primarily just right down the street from Federal Hall. It did start in about 1655. And slave auctions remained in New York City throughout the 1800s. They were illegal as of 1826, but they continued for many years after that illegally. And one thing that I found really interesting, I know we typically think of slaveholders as being in the South, and it's important to know that over 40% of the population in the city of New York owned slaves. And in fact, Brooklyn had more slave owners than any city outside of Charleston, South Carolina. So by 1730, over 40% of the population owned slaves. We are fast forwarding in history to another chaotic scene. Again, we're just pivoting from the New York Stock Exchange and going back to Federal Hall for 1918. And if you can go back in your memory to what you learned about history, this would have been around World War I. And so it's actually Charlie Chaplin that's standing on somebody's shoulders there. And he is there to promote the sale of war bonds. So again, if you see the big US flags flying, that is just really to incite patriotism and to kind of spur the crowd to go ahead and purchase war bonds, which would help the US's effort. And right behind Charlie Chaplin, those are in fact the boots of George Washington. So again, fun to see that George Washington has overseen many historic moments in our history. Fast forwarding again to the stock market of today. So this building that was built in 1903 is a little bit different from the Buttonwood tree that traders used to gather around. And most trading floors are now electronic, and the New York Stock Exchange is no different. So they've really replaced a lot of the yelling that would occur between the traders, and most of that trading is now done online. But the New York Stock Exchange does remain the only major equities trading floor left in the world. So they still do use some floor trading in addition to electronic trading. And people on the floor today are the brokers, otherwise known as the market makers. And they're really tasked with matching buyers and sellers and minimizing stock price volatility. So they are still a really important part of the financial system in New York City and the world. At its height, the New York Stock Exchange had 5,000 people a day on its floor. And I've talked to a number of people who used to be brokers back in the 80s and 90s, and they said just the noise, it was just crazy, but your adrenaline would get going because you just had to yell to be heard. And, you know, think of 5,000 people all yelling over each other, and it was just this really incredible, crazy, hectic environment. But as soon as things moved online, a lot of the older traders said, oh, it's just really boring. You know, you don't have that same energy that you had back when there were so many of us on the floor. Today, there are about 500 people on the floor at any time. And also, if you watch any sort of news, you'll see that there are a lot of media outlets. In fact, about 33 media outlets have a presence at the New York Stock Exchange as well. Little fun fact on ringing the bell. We've all seen the bell ringing. There actually is a protocol to that. So if you are opening the stock exchange, you have to ring the bell for 10 seconds. And if you are closing the stock exchange, you ring the bell for 15 seconds. And if you don't do it right, everyone on the floor boos you. So that is an incentive to get it right. We are now going to walk straight down the street, and we are going to walk to Fraunces Tavern. So again, you can kind of see on this map, we were at the New York Stock Exchange. We're just going to walk down the street to the red dot next to Insomnia Cookies, which is Fraunces Tavern. Fraunces Tavern is one of those buildings, again, that looks really old, but alas, it's not. So this current building was built in the 1900s, but the original Fraunces Tavern dates back to the 1600s. And remember that Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, was settled by the Dutch. And one thing we know about the Dutch is they love water. So if you've been to Amsterdam, you see all the canals, and oftentimes you'll see houses that are built on stilts. They're coming out of the canals. Fraunces Tavern was built on water. So historically, when the Dutch were developing the island, one of the opportunities that they gave inhabitants of the island was they could basically receive a plot of water. And they would get that for free, and they had to commit to filling in that water with landfill, and that would then give them the land that they could then build a building on. So that's really how the island of Manhattan was developed. Back in the times of the Dutch, around the 1640s, the actual island of Manhattan was about the width of 3 city blocks. Today, it is much wider, so that gives you an idea of exactly how much of the island has really been built out through landfill. And it really started back with the Dutch saying, hey, be an opportunistic, take this piece of water and fill it in with a bunch of garbage and build a building on it. So yes, New York City is in many ways built on trash, but we're still standing, so it obviously worked. But Fraunces Tavern, where this building is, would have been the end of the island of Manhattan. So again, think of that when you walk through Lower Manhattan. It's crazy that how much exists that used to be water. And there are lots of things that happened at Fraunces Tavern. The New York Chamber of Commerce was established at Fraunces Tavern, and the tavern also hosted spies. So after the Dutch, the British came in and were ruling New York and the rest of the country. And the Sons of Liberty were a secret organization. Given their name, you could tell that they were working for the revolution. So their goal really was to look at how to plot the movement for independence. And if you go to Fraunces Tavern today, it is a restaurant, but it's also a museum. And if you go to the second and third floors, you'll get to see some of the instruments that the Sons of Liberty used and how they used to code letters and pass them amongst themselves. But that all took place right around the corner from King's at Fraunces Tavern. And again, this building was rebuilt in the 1900s. It is currently owned by the Sons of the Revolution of New York City, and it does function as a museum and a restaurant. So unfortunately, the bulk of the building burned in 1832, again in 1837, and then 1857 fires wiped out anything that may have been remaining. So they did a really good job of preserving the history by rebuilding it to what it would have looked like. If you go inside Fraunces Tavern and go upstairs to the museum, if you're a fan of Hamilton, you will be familiar with the room where it happens. And the really awesome thing is this is the room where it happened. So on December 4th, 1783, George Washington was here, and he bid farewell to his officers. So he was leaving New York City and returning to Mount Vernon. And in this very room was where all of that happened. We now know that George Washington came back to New York City just a few years later, 1789. That's where we started, and he was back for his inauguration as president. As we continue our walk through Lower Manhattan, one thing to take a look at is the street signs. And New York City has done something kind of fun. So anytime you see a black street sign, these are the original names of the streets. And one thing you'll see on these signs is it's not a road or street, it's called Old Slip. And again, remember, this was all water. These were waterways. Think of, again, if you've been to Amsterdam or any city with canals, that's kind of what New York City looked like. So if you were coming into the port of New York and you had stuff to sell, you would pull into whatever slip was going to offload whatever you were selling. So that's why we have names like Beaver Street. New York was well known for having a lot of beaver pelts. They came from upstate New York as well as Canada. And if you were buying or selling beaver pelts, you would pull your boat into the slip of what is now Beaver Street. Pearl Street, same sort of thing. New York had a lot of oysters. We still do have oysters, actually. They're recreating the oyster beds. And, you know, if you wanted pearls, you would pull your boat into Pearl Slip, which is now Pearl Street. So just kind of fun as you walk around Manhattan, look for those black signs because they are the original names of the street. Some are Dutch, and these obviously are British. This is the remnant of a tavern. This is right next to the building that used to be the Goldman Sachs headquarters building before they moved to New Jersey, but it is kind of right in front of Fraunces Tavern. And it was discovered in the 1980s when they were trying to put in a parking lot under the building. So as part of the excavations, they realized, wow, this actually dates back to 1641. And this would have been the tavern that was actually built by Francis Lovelace, who was New York City's second British governor. And one fun thing about this is similar to New York today, most of us who are New Yorkers, we don't entertain a whole lot in our homes because our apartments, our homes tend to be pretty small. And the governor was the same. He got tired of entertaining dignitaries anytime anyone came to visit. They would come to his home and he would have to be hospitable. And so he basically established this tavern as a way to entertain visiting dignitaries, but then he could just leave whenever he wanted to. Also important to know that taverns were really the center of society. It's where everything happened. Again, you didn't have space in your own homes to have large groups of people meet and really anything more than a couple of people. So the tavern would be where local business was transacted. If you were a banker, you would kind of set up at the local tavern and exchange funds. So it really was the center of business and commerce in New York City as well as throughout the U.S. at that time, which there wasn't much in the U.S. at that time. We were still very much a growing country. And now we're going to walk just a little bit further south to the tip of the island of Manhattan, and we are going to visit the Hamilton Custom House. And this is what the Hamilton Custom House looks like from afar. And I always like to ask students if it reminds them of anything. And I'll flash to another picture to see if it reminds you of this. This is the Opera House of Paris, and the Hamilton Custom House is modeled off of the Paris Opera House. And you might be wondering, why on earth would the Hamilton Custom House be modeled off of the Opera House in Paris? And think of the time. This was built in 1902 to 1907. It was designed by Cass Gilbert. He got around. He's the same guy who brought us the Woolworth Building and many other notable buildings of that time. But the custom house, again, would have been where the ship's captain or his designate would come and pay your bill. For many, it would basically be your introduction to New York City. Think of all that we as a country had to prove to the rest of the world in the 1900s, right? We wanted to prove like we are as good as Europe. Not only are we as good as, we are better than Europe. So this building spared no expense, and it really replicates many of just the gorgeous buildings in Europe. And I have some pictures of the interior that I'll show you as well. But I want to start by looking at the outside, because this is a great glimpse into history and what people thought of the different continents. So there were 4 large statues outside, and they represent the 4 main trading continents. So sorry, Australia and Antarctica, you don't get a statue. But this is the first statue that we're looking at. And this is the statue of Europe. So just take a look for a minute at how the woman is dressed, kind of what is surrounding her, kind of get a picture of what's going on there for just a second. So as I said before, this is Europe, and this really is a depiction of Europe as a conquering nation. Think of how the woman is dressed, very ornate. You know, you can kind of see it's almost a tapestry type, a brocade sort of gown, just really beautiful, ornate. She has her hand on the book of knowledge. The book of knowledge rests on the world, which they have conquered. You know, Europe had all of the trade routes. They were going around the world before many other countries were. And if you look to the left, that is the bow of a ship. So again, representing Europe's dominance of the seas. And then again, just some icons behind her, kind of the lion and the eagle, just really representing the regal empire of Europe. Next one, if you can guess to see what continent this statue represents, take just a second to kind of look at the different features of this one. And this is North America. The first thing to notice is the plainer clothing. And North America, the US in particular, we were built on the Protestant work ethic, right? We don't need any of that fancy clothing because we are busy working. And so it's kind of representative of that concept. But look at what is in her lap. That is a sheaf of wheat, and that historically represents the concept of bounty. So again, just showing, through our hard work ethic, that's also represented by the man, the strong man, kneeling at her side. Demonstrates how much we are committed to continuing to build and grow America and the rest of North America. There's also a sense of hope that there is more to come. The torch, very representative of the Statue of Liberty, but we're lighting the world as we go. So definitely a lot of hope in this statue. Next, see if you can take a look at this one and see which continent it is. Heads up, we only have 2 left, Africa and Asia. This, as you hopefully realize from the Sphinx, the pharaoh on the side there, is from Africa. And notice a couple things. This statue is sleeping and the statue is naked. Again, 1900s. This would have been the representation of Africa. It was known as the sleeping country, and its inhabitants were seen as being naked or uncultured. So again, back in the 1900s, we weren't doing a ton, the US wasn't doing a ton of trade with Africa, but you'll even see, the lion, very docile lion, so kind of alluding to there might be power, but we're not sure because the lion is currently asleep. And again, it's interesting that they have some of the Egyptian architecture that is built into that kind of reckoning of this is what the continent of Africa was. And again, you're just kind of left with, it's not a very encouraging image of Africa, right? You're just kind of seeing that maybe there's some potential there, but we're not sure at this point. And then last but not least, we are left with Asia. So take a look at all the images associated with Asia. And there are a few interesting things going on with this statue. First of all, you'll just see the Buddhist imagery. You'll see there's a Buddha sitting on the statue's lap. And you'll also note the skulls underneath the feet of the statue. And this is because Asia was seen as being a non-Christian country. So if you lived in Asia, you were bound for hell. That's the imagery of the statues. And that's also represented just by the people. If you look at the people on the side, they're destitute, right? They are hopeless. So again, just thinking back to the 1900s, our image, our concept of Asia was, wow, there are all these hordes of unsafe people, just a lot of hopelessness. And again, interesting that you kind of see the image of the cross. There is definitely a history of Catholicism within Asia, so that's why you see that stylized cross that we see a lot in the Catholic Church. But in general, just really representative, very similar to Africa, and just kind of this overall sense of hopelessness. So now we are going inside, and if you were the ship's captain, you would walk inside the building and you would hopefully just be wowed by seeing, the depiction of your statue out front and center. You see how awesome Europe is. And then you walk inside to the collector's office. And this is a room, you have to have a private tour to access this room. The rest of the museum, you can wander around for free, but you can get in here, you just have to sign up, register ahead. But a few things in this room, you would walk in and around the top of the room, you see images of all of the port cities that would be representative of the main port cities that New York was trading with. So this is a picture of the port of Amsterdam. You can kind of sort of see that from the flags flying from the ship. So if you were a Dutch captain, you would walk in and the first thing you would see your port city. So hopefully that would give you some pleasant memories of, oh right, that's where I came from. And you'd be in a good mood to turn over all of your cash that you owed to the US. This, again, just kind of shows the opulence. This was the room to show off the wealth of this new and growing country of the US. And there's so much symbolism in here, but these ceilings were designed by Tiffany. We often think of Tiffany as being stained glass. They were really an artistic studio, so they did lots of different things, including ceilings. So all this imagery is courtesy of Tiffany. There are lots of fun things in there. You'll see acorns, symbol of growth. The small acorn grows into a mighty oak tree throughout the US. We love that imagery. And we also see some different representations of Poseidon. Mercury, who is the Roman god of commerce, is also present in a lot of the details. And just a close-up of some of the imagery. This is the woodwork that is throughout that collector's office room, and again, the abundance of the sheaves of grain on the side, some of the Roman imagery that represents trade and commerce. So you're just kind of smacked with all things about abundance and wealth. Another thing that you'll see throughout this building, there are actually dollar signs. So as you go into the collector's office, there is a gate that you have to go through, and intertwined in the very ornate detail of that gate are dollar signs, which I just love. It's it's very clear what this building is for. It's all about the money, all about showcasing the US's wealth and our rising image as a world power in the early 1900s. We are now leaving the collector's office and we're going into the main rotunda. And today this is just an empty area, but if you can just kind of close your eyes and visualize this would have been staffed with all sorts of clerks. So that your first place you would have gone would be to come up to one of the desks that would have been here. The clerk would have basically gone over your bill of lading, which outlined the cargo that you had, and then you would be sent to the collector's office to pay your dues. But if you just kind of look around this room, this rotunda was built at the time. It was the largest unsupported rotunda in the United States, so it was really an architectural feat in and of itself. And then if you look at the images around the room, I'll get to a close-up in a second, but these were all images of historic U.S. vessels. And this is just a close-up of one of those images. So again, as you are looking at all of these features, you would have seen, wow, you know, the U.S. also is a world power in shipping and in industry and in all things dealing with the sea. So again, just kind of another subtle message there that the U.S. was as powerful as other countries coming to visit us. All right, so now we are going to exit the Custom House and we are going to take a step back in time, and we are looking at Bowling Green. So this is as you're exiting the steps of the Custom House, you're now, boom, looking at Bowling Green. And this picture dates back to 1776, and I'm sure we all know what happened in 1776. It was the U.S. Revolution. So today we have a lot of debate going on about tearing down statues. Is that good? Is that bad? And interesting to note that we have a long history of tearing down statues in the U.S. And Bowling Green in 1776, there was a large statue of King George. And during the Revolution, this picture depicts that some of the revolutionaries were tearing down the statue of King George. And King George really met an unfortunate end. He actually was melted down to make bullets. So poor King George was erected by the British and then essentially weaponized and turned against the British, used by US to basically win the revolution against the British. This is what that area looks like today. The statue would have been about where the fountain is today. And when you come tour New York City, one fun thing to take a look at is that fence, because that fence actually dates back to the 1770s. And if you look at the fence closely, you can see that at the top of the fence, the top of each of the fence posts, there would have been a little crown of England. And of course, after the Revolution, we had to come and saw all those off. So you can actually see where they were sawn off. But just really neat that this fence has been around for centuries, you know, since the 1770s. It's still there. We can still see it today. We are standing in front of Bowling Green, and if we just turn and look to the left, we are going to take a look at what used to be 3 ship buildings. And New York City was really the center point of not only shipping, but also of the cruise industry. So think back to the 1900s. This was before airplanes were widely in commercial use. And the only way to travel outside of the US was by ship. And again, because New York City was such a big port, it for years has really been a center of travel. And New York City was really the center of the cruise line industry. So we're going to go through the White Star Line, the Red Star Line, and the Cunard Line, because they all had their offices in a row, starting at the very tip of Broadway. We're going to start with One Broadway, and this was where one of the shipping lines, this is where the White Star Line was located, and it is currently a Citibank. So you may just be going, you know, walking by and seeing, oh, it's a Citibank, I hope they have an ATM, I need a little bit of cash, and go in and not even notice all of the glories of this building that are part of what it originally was. First thing, as you walk in, this is the entrance to the ATM. So if you walk in through this door, hopefully you'll notice the sign which says first class. And if you notice just even on the outside of the building, those beautiful lamps. So it just, automatically, and think of it without the Citibank awning, it would have been even more beautiful. But really, wanting to create this private entrance for all of you who were traveling via first class. Number 1, Broadway. Addresses still matter a lot in New York City. You want to have an address that is on a prominent street, so you want to be on Broadway or Park Avenue or Madison. And it's funny because some buildings actually will only have a sliver of the actual building on the street. And you'll actually, the main entrance will be on a totally different street, but they'll have the 100 Park Avenue address. So it was no coincidence that White Star Lines, one of the largest shipping lines, was at number 1 Broadway, right? They're still number 1. No coincidence there. And again, just take a look at the architecture. You'll see some of the key features. You can kind of see the nautical themes already just on the outside in that one little photo. The outside of the building was also an advertising, essentially a billboard of all the locations that White Star Lines could transport you to. And again, you'll see if you look at the top of the building, there are about 30 images just like this. And here they're focusing on Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. And again, as you walk by, this would have been the hub of transit for New York City. And it again would have been just this great advertisement for, don't you want to go to see exotic Buenos Aires or exotic Rio? And I just love how that still exists today as this wonderful advertisement for why you should go explore the world. If you go inside the Citibank building, most of the interior is still original. And if you were a passenger at the time, think of the first time you go in to buy a ticket. You're looking for a few things, right? You probably may or may not have actually taken a cruise ship across the ocean before. So you might have a little trepidation about doing that. And that's one of the reasons why when you walk inside, you see a lot of really opulent features, a lot of marble, this beautiful compass that is inlaid into the floor. So as soon as you walk in, it's like, oh, wow, this is a legitimate enterprise. They're going to be here. I'm going to have a great trip. And then as you walk around, there are these beautiful images of maps of the world on all of the walls. And again, just really reinforcing, the quality of the experience that you're going to have. And remember, there were 3 shipping lines in a row. So you would, as a passenger, would have had an opportunity to kind of check out each office. And we're going to get to Cunard in a second, but you definitely would have had an opportunity to kind of figure out, just simply based on the features in the building and how nice things looked and how inspirational these buildings presented themselves, that would have in large part really positioned you to figure out what cruise line you wanted to use. This next building, alas, has been turned into a Subway and a wine store, but this used to be the Red Star Line. And Red Star Line and White Star Line were really competing shipping lines, cruise lines, and they're pretty equivalent as far as the type of offerings that they had. And then just up the street, so there are 3 buildings in a row. This is the 3rd building. This is the Cunard Line, and the Cunard Line is the only line that still exists. They actually acquired the Red Star Line, but the Cunard Line, they sail the Queen Mary among other boats. So if you've heard of the Queen Mary, Cunard Line is still alive and well. And the Cunard Line is known as being a luxury line. And this is the interior of the Cunard Line building. So if you remember what the White Star Line looked like, the White Star Line was really nice. It was not opulent. This is just simply over the top, ridiculously opulent, right? But if you were traveling on the Cunard Line, you would be paying thousands of dollars for a ticket. So it would have been, you would have expected much more luxury. And again, the second you can see there, that's the front door where you would have been entering. So the second you enter the door of their offices, you just would have been blown away with how beautiful everything was. And that experience was replicated in all of their ships. Cunard is still known as having the most beautiful, the most luxurious ship experience. But again, just also indicative of the role that the cruise line and the cruise industry played in really building the business of New York City. And unfortunately, it's not all a happy story here. I wanted to fast forward to the Titanic, and the Titanic was actually owned by the Red Star Line. And I wanted to offer two competing headlines here. Originally, when the first headlines about the Titanic came out, definitely a PR move on the part of Red Star Line. They're like, don't worry, everyone is fine. And it wasn't until about 24 hours later that reports started to come out that, in fact, everything wasn't fine, that there were many casualties. This is a picture of that area with people waiting for the list of survivors. And just to orient you, over on the left here, this is Bowling Green. You can see the building in the top corner in the left-hand side. That is the Alexander Hamilton Custom House. So we're still right in the same area that we've been in for a while now. But what would happen is, as the different ship lines would pick up some of the rescued passengers, those would be transmitted via telegraph to the Red Star Line. And so all of these people were waiting several times throughout the day. Somebody from the Red Star Line would come out and read off the new list of survivors. And so all of these people are gathered there waiting to hear the name of their loved one or relative. And again, that street is still exactly the same. If any of us who've walked by, it still is an interesting intersection that we have to approach with caution. But this is all still exactly as it was back then. And this, we're just looking up the street now. So the building that you see on the right-hand side, that would have been the Red Star Line building. So now we're looking at the Charging Bull. And the Charging Bull is an emblem of New York City. It's one of the top tourist attractions. I think I got this photo at 7 in the morning, so I had to get up early to get there before all of the tourists. But normally, this is just surrounded by people taking all sorts of pictures of it. And the fun thing about this, it is actually guerrilla art. So in 1989, an Italian sculptor, Arturo de Modica, decided that he loved New York City. He loved the energy, he loved the vibrancy, and he loved the fact that we are the finance capital of the world. And he wanted to give back in some way. So he dropped off this huge multi-ton statue smack dab in front of the New York Stock Exchange in the middle of the night. So think of, if you're a trader at the New York Stock Exchange, or you're grabbing your coffee, walking to work, a little blurry-eyed, and like, boom, this huge bull is right in front of the front door of the New York Stock Exchange, and it wasn't there when you left the night before. That's what we're dealing with. So the city actually didn't know what to do with this, and it actually took them a while to even find a truck that was large enough to be able to transport the bull. And they kind of figured out, after a while, the guy kind of came forward and said, I did it, and I would love for you, the city, to, permanently display it somewhere. So they came to an agreement, and it is now displayed right in front of Bowling Green. I think there are plans to move it just because it is right in front of Bowling Green, and a lot of times tourists will run across the traffic to get to it. So I think that they are working on moving it a little bit closer to the stock exchange so we can protect all the tourists who come to New York City. Now we are going to walk directly up Broadway. So if you can see on this map, you see kind of the green part of the Battery, and then you see that little triangle of green, which is Bowling Green. That's where we were. We're going to walk straight up Broadway, and we're going to end our time at Trinity Church. This is Trinity Church, and I wanted to start with this view of Trinity Church, which is looking at it from the back, because the original Trinity Church was flipped. So originally Trinity Church's entrance would have been where the back currently is. The primary reason for that was, think back to 1698. This was when the original church building was constructed. And as I mentioned before, Manhattan was really narrow. It was about 3 city blocks wide. And Trinity Church was an oceanfront or a harborfront church. So their front door would have looked out at New York Harbor. There was nothing in front of it except for water. So again, just kind of crazy like when you come and see that in person, to be able to visualize all of the land that used to be water is just kind of crazy. And this is actually the third church building that has been constructed. Like many buildings in Manhattan, Trinity Church unfortunately was consumed by a fire. They were lost by the Great Fire in 1776. And again, many of the buildings in Lower Manhattan were lost in that fire and in subsequent fires in the 1800s. The steeple, as you may remember from one of our first pictures of Federal Hall, the steeple was the highest point in the city and was visible from the harbor. So again, I just love that image of the steeple of the church being a navigational point for all of the ship captains. The second church was built in 1790, and then the church that we're looking at right now was actually built in 1846. And it is the current church, the third and current church, and it has neo-Gothic architecture. The original land for the church was a grant from the Queen of England. So going back to 1698, this would have been during the British occupation of New York. And the Queen of England provided the church with 250 acres that ran from Fulton Street to Christopher Street. And that is in large part why today Trinity Church, no one really knows for sure because churches don't have to disclose a lot of their financials, but the church, Trinity Church, is thought to be the second wealthiest church outside of the Vatican. And a lot of this is because they still have a significant amount of holdings in commercial real estate. So what we do know is they get about $150 million a year just from the rental income of the land that they still own. And sometimes they own the land. And if you are in New York City and you build a building that is owned, the land is owned by somebody else, you still have to pay the rent for the land. And sometimes they actually still own the office building. So throughout their history, they've been very smart in how they have utilized that land. They're now down to much less. I think they still own about 15 of the original 250 acres. A few other things about Trinity Church, it really was the hub. It was the place to see and be seen. So in many ways, church today is, where we connect with a lot of people. We obviously are fed spiritually at our churches. Trinity Church played that role as well. It was also where all of the key business people in New York City met and mingled. We also know that King's College, the original King's College, not the King's College, but King's College that became Columbia, was founded there in 1754. Trinity Church also has a very long history of being entrepreneurial. So in addition to getting that land, we'll come back to that in a second, they also, because they were a waterfront church, every once in a while, they would have a whale that would basically wash ashore. And back in those days, way before electricity, one of the primary sources of light was from whale oil. So Trinity Church went to the state of New York and said, we want to get a charter that allows us to basically harvest and sell the whale oil of any whales that happen to drift ashore and land on our property. And they actually did get the charter. It's not known, unfortunately, we don't know if they actually were able to do that, if any whales did drift ashore that they were able to harvest. But I just think it's amazing that back then they were being so amazing in really finding unique ways to generate revenue or attempt to generate revenue. But another thing that they did, Alexander Hamilton was a member of this church. And in 1796, the church realized that they were being restricted. So with the land grant, they basically had to commit to not earning more than 5,000 British pounds sterling a year. And by 1796, the church was renting a lot of its property, and they were making a lot more than that. So Alexander Hamilton actually argued the church's case to the Queen of England, I'm assuming her representatives, and basically got that overturned. So we have many things that we can be thankful for Hamilton, but one of them is he allowed the church, Trinity Church, to earn a lot more money. This is the interior of the church, and again, if you have been to Europe, to a European church, this looks very similar, right? We have the beauty of the interior of the church, the stained glass, great organ in there, and it looks very familiar to anyone who has been in a European church. One unique thing, another way the Trinity Church made money, a lot of churches made money this way, was to actually rent out pews. So if you were a prominent family member, you again would want to see and be seen, and a guaranteed way to be seen would be to actually own a pew. So for a princely sum, you could rent a pew and get your name on it. And the great thing about this is that this gives us a ton of history of the church. So you get to know exactly who the family members were who rented pews. These pews were so valuable that they would be passed on from generation to generation in people's wills. So, you know, a family member like the Astor family, they would have owned a pew for generations. But through these historical records, we know, for instance, that Captain Kidd, the famous pirate, he was a member of Trinity Church, so when he wasn't out marauding and pillaging, he would come and pray, repent perhaps, but also the church used his equipment. So he had some tackling equipment. You know, when you climb the top of a mast to change out the sail, you have different grappling hooks and stuff, and he was kind enough to loan those to the church as they built a steeple on the second church building. So a prominent member of the church. Also, if we take a look at the Trinity Church graveyard, this again is just a wealth of information about the history of business in New York City. So we have many prominent individuals, but among them we have Robert Fulton. He's the person who built the steamboat that traveled from New York City to Albany. And again, once you're in Albany, you could go up through the Erie Canal. So it really was responsible for opening up an entirely new trade route for us. Fulton was also commissioned by Napoleon Bonaparte to design the Nautilus, a submarine. So a pretty innovative guy. Of course, we have Alexander Hamilton. We're going to end on him. But we also have Albert Gallatin. He was the U.S. minister to the UK, also founded NYU. We have William Bradford, who was the printer who fought for freedom of the press. And that trial actually happened in Federal Hall. So when I started, I said Federal Hall was used for many things. Another thing, they actually held the trial. But because of William Bradford, we really have what today we know as freedom of the press. And then, of course, the Astor family. They became very wealthy through shipping, through real estate and finance. And one great thing that continues to be true of many wealthy business owners is that they give back to the church. So one of the reasons why Trinity Church is as beautiful as it is, as ornate as it is, and has as much programming as it does, is because of the contributions of wealthy family members who have over centuries given back to the church. And we are going to end with Alexander Hamilton. So this is Alexander Hamilton's tomb. And Alexander Hamilton is buried there, But there are also a bunch of other people that are buried there, and we don't exactly know who. So about the time that Hamilton passed away, there was a yellow fever epidemic, and unfortunately people were dying in such quantities that any open tomb essentially became a common pauper's tomb. So the church knows, all they know is, yep, there are a bunch of bodies in there. We're not entirely sure who else is buried in there, but Trinity Church graveyard, like many graveyards, really became an area of containment for yellow fever, so a way to basically dispose of the bodies. But I just love the fact that we can end our tour with Alexander Hamilton, who did so many amazing things for the history of New York, but among them really built the financial systems, established the financial systems as we now know it. Back in the Panic of 1792, he was the one guy who had a strong and logical standing on the role of banks and the role of the financial institution, and really looked to the UK and replicated a lot of the financial system of the UK, and in many ways saved the United States from ourselves and established the banking and financial institutions that we have. So we're going to end there on how New York City really got its roots in being an entrepreneur in so many different things. And again, just being thankful to Alexander Hamilton and the role that he played in helping build the spirit of entrepreneurship and financial independence that leaves us in good stead throughout the world. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this virtual walking tour.